What are the differences between vintage sewing patterns in the UK versus the US? Well, hello friends, my name is Stephanie Canada, and that is actually the question we're going to attempt to be answering today. Do I feel slightly like Lawrence from Lost in the Pond, which is a channel that if you enjoy my channel, you probably will enjoy his because his sarcasm is way better than mine? A little, yes, I do. However, we will move forward anyway, without the illustrious British accent and the zingers that he hands out, although I will do my best to find some in there somewhere. Maybe. Hopefully. Not sure yet. Now, this video is a direct pull from my community tab. Yes, it was quite a long time ago, and I am very sorry for that, but here we are anyway, because I just had to give up on the idea of matching pattern for pattern, which is what I was trying to do this entire time, was find the exact duplicates and even the exact size so we could figure it all out. And, well, I feel like if we would have done that, I would have probably been here until I looked like that old face filter on TikTok. Here, hang on a second. Well, I mean, I guess it's not wrong. I have gathered a smattering of patterns. Smattering, that's a fun word. Haven't used that one in a while. I have gathered a smattering of patterns from the 1940s all the way to the late 1950s. Sorry I couldn't go much farther than that. We get lucky to find patterns from the UK around here. But during this time period, I do think there was a pretty distinct shift, so I'm glad that we have just the patterns that we have. So go ahead and grab your beverage of choice. Mine is water because, courtesy of Florida, it is 90 degrees with 90% humidity outside, so water is necessary. And let's go ahead and look at the differences. And color me surprised to realize the first difference in the envelope. Now, the main difference that you're going to see in these envelopes are a shocking lack of color, at least in the British version for a little while. So the first and very obvious difference in those envelopes is that until about the mid-1950s, the British printings are black and white. And I understand that this is a very small grouping of patterns and that this does not indicate the entirety of the patterns that are out there. However, this is just to give you a taste. So when we first look at them, you can see that the 1940s one are black and white, whereas even in the US in the 1940s, they were printing in color. Now, the most obvious and immediate difference is going to be the money on it. Money, money, money. I don't know why. Obviously, everything in US is in US dollars, actually in this case, US cents, and everything on the UK version is going to be shillings/pence, at least as I understand it as a person who has never actually been to the UK. So those of you that are watching from there, please feel free to comment down below and tell me if I'm wrong. But I think after the last video, that's what y'all told me. Could be remembering wrong though. It is possible. Now, as to the why of why they're different, I'm not 100% sure. I have my guesses surrounding rationing, and maybe colorful ink was just more expensive than the general black and white ink, and also that the texture of the paper that feels different feels a little bit coarser, probably again due to some type of rationing efforts. And as rationing ended in 1954, I'm gonna say that's probably where it comes from. But again, this is just my conjecture. Other things to note is that the actual style, at least of the two earliest patterns, are vastly different. And the 1948 seems to really go the hardest into this different type of envelope. I almost feel like this is going to be something that's more like a regular envelope that you would have just mass ordered, because it's very rare to see a pattern that has a seam down the middle and along the bottom that's quite so hard. Normally on a 48 McCall's, what you would look at is while there is a side seam here and here, the entire front and back is one piece that's just folded over. And then the flappy bit. So that to me really leans into the more rationing efforts, because even the 1951 Butterick, which isn't exactly the same as the McCall's, you can still tell a little bit of a difference, but this one seems a little bit more planned. There's a seam along the bottom here, and there's also a seam along the side, but there's nothing cutting the design in the middle. That makes me think that this envelope right here might have been made exactly for the whole purpose of a pattern, whereas the 1948 McCall's, I think, was just any old general envelope that got printed on, which, hey, if it works, it works. You can't really complain. Another difference on the envelopes is going to be that the very earliest say plus purchase tax, whereas the ones in the US, everyone just assumes you're going to pay tax, so they don't feel the need to print that on the envelope. There is general styling differences, and also this McCall from 48 has a little black star on it, whereas its counterpart from 48 in the US does not. But you can also see that the McCall label is actually very much the same, whereas you can tell they did have probably slightly different artists over on the other side of the pond, but the styling remained fairly similar. One other interesting thing to note about the McCalls in particular is that, especially in the 40s, McCalls had this thing for extending their graphics all the way down the envelope, flap even. Whereas you can see on the 1948 McCalls, it seems like the image got shrunk so that it would fit actually on the proper envelope instead of also on the flappy bit. Flappy bit! We use technical terms here on this channel. The other thing to note about the texture is that the differences almost completely disappear by the mid-1950s, primarily because the UK is now importing patterns from the US, as you can now see on these examples here, where this one has a little blacked out stamp where you can clearly see the 65 cents underneath, and also the pattern book has been blacked out on the envelope flap. Not really 100% sure why they opted to do that, but choices were made. And on another 1950s McCalls, you can tell they didn't even bother anymore because they just stamped that new price right on and moved on with their lives. And this is 21st century me reaching back and apologizing to 20th century sewists in the UK. I'm sorry we gave you our garbage measurements on the back too, because from yardage to width of fabric to the body measurements, we didn't even bother to try and change that for you. And even though it's 2021, I still feel a little bit guilty for the fact that we made you go through all of that. Now, before we get too much farther into this, I'm going to assume that you realize by now that I actually was able to grab one of the same patterns. And to be quite honest, I didn't actually know that this had happened until I was actually pulling the patterns last night and realized that somehow I had not only the US version, but I also had the UK version. Well, I knew I had the UK version, but I had completely forgotten this. I had this listed on my website. So here we are. Huzzah! I feel like I won the lottery. They're not the same bust size, so I can't measure and tell you about any differences there, but the fact that I found two of the same is pretty freaking impressive. And now with the envelopes all sized up, let's dive on into the instructions. But wait, what's that? Oh, why thank you for noticing. Yes, indeed, I am wearing my vintage sewist brooch that I have paired up with Quirky Turkey Designs as my first merch. We'll call it that. It may not have my channel name, but it does evoke the feeling of what I'd like to create here. So if you are interested in buying one of these, they are located over on my website, backroomfinds.com, and it's basically the very first thing on the front page. Now, these are only available through today for pre-order. So if you are interested in grabbing one of these, they do measure a little bit over 2 inches by about 1.5 inches, which is a little over 5.5 and a little over 3 centimeters for those that aren't in the US dealing with our garbage measuring system. So if you are interested in grabbing one of those, please do feel free to pick one up today. Oh, and if you stayed to the end of the video, there might be an extra little giveaway. I can't wink. Did that come across? No? Okay, great, we're gonna move on.
Here we are, moving right along now.
And while my 1940 pattern actually showed up with no instructions whatsoever, unintentionally, the 1950s patterns don't have that problem. But they do have a size difference. Because yes, friends, you did guess it correctly, and also I'm not good at being subtle. The difference is the size. The British instructions are much, much smaller. Probably about 1/3 smaller than the American counterparts. They're printed on a smooth white paper, whereas the American version is printed on a more craft paper style that definitely is a little bit more fragile, as opposed to the one from the Brits that actually feels still pretty supple and not like it's going to tear when you sneeze on it, unlike the American ones because, well, it's on basically craft paper. One thing I will say is that they took that sizing down literally. Even the text is smaller. So good luck trying to read that without pulling out your extra glasses. And just from the glance that I took, it actually looks like they just literally copy and pasted word for word, so they didn't bother to rewrite them at all, so at least that's kind of nice, that if you do find the British pattern, that you are getting the exact same instructions as the Americans. Again, get yourself a good vintage sewing booklet to go along with it, because they're not the best. They assume a lot of knowledge. And then when we look at the mid-50s McCalls, you realize that, oh, hey, look, they're imported from the US. They look exactly like the US patterns, because they are. But then as we get over into the simplicities that are actually purely printed in different countries, we do see a little bit of difference. Now, while these aren't the exact same pattern, so I can't really fully explain all the differences because they're not one for one, but I tried to grab similar styles assuming that the instructions would be pretty close. You can see that on the US, it's again the standard craft paper, but it's all on one sheet, one front and one back. Whereas on the British version, there's a couple differences. First up, you can see that the paper is again that nicer, lighter white color, but I will say that they started moving toward the craft style paper, like their cousins in the US, because the texture is starting to get very similar. But the first thing that pops out to me are the giant ads right along the bottom, which we definitely do not do in the US versions. And then when we turn it over to the back, you can see that they're pretty much similar as far as the amount of information that's given. So I just wonder if the one from the UK just has a bit more complexity, because that's why they felt the need to add the second page. And the second page on the front looks pretty standard, right? Nothing terribly exciting, nothing really odd. Until you turn it over. We definitely don't have that in the US. What's really interesting is they gave a very, very detailed breakdown of exactly how to use their patterns and what all the little notches and markings mean. Now, occasionally you might see things like this actually printed on the tissue in the US, but I have never ever seen this exact style on an actual pattern in the US. This is actually some of the information that when you buy the Simplicity branded sewing books that they would have put in the books that you had to buy separately here in the US. So I'm wondering if maybe in the UK they were like, hey, let's give those sewists a little bit better of a chance to try and make up this garment. What an idea.
It's brilliant, 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 I tell you. Genius, I say.
And by the late 1950s, we're still looking at pretty much the same differences. Although I will say that Butterick generally seems to have made smaller instructions all the way around. But you can see that again, the color and texture is different, and the sizing, while not as drastic as earlier, is still just a little bit smaller. And before the ink dries on that moment, let's go ahead and look at the pattern pieces. Now, the most important thing to start out with is that McCall's is always going to be different. McCall's had patented the printed tissue long earlier in the process, so they were able to hold on to that patent for quite some time before the other companies finally were able to start doing that. But I will say that there is something about the transition, or possibly maybe it was just the equipment that was available, that the British patterns remain unprinted for quite some time longer. At least in Butterick's. For the early 1940s, you can see that we're still on this white tissue. It is a little bit more supple, but you can really tell that this is a very different printing process than the 1948 McCall's. However, they all still have the lines because McCall's had patented that earlier and probably had shipped all that equipment over before the war because they had been printing on their patterns since the early 1900s. And then for the mid-1950s, again, because they had been imported from the US, they look exactly like the US copies. Shocking, I know. But for the Buttericks, in 51, when you're seeing these ones that are actually printed over in the UK, we actually have unprinted tissue. And the texture actually feels a little bit smoother than the actual ones from the US, but not as drastically as the McCall's from 48. And by the time we get to 1957, Simplicity has begun to print on their patterns over in the UK. Huzzah! But they do still have that slicker feeling as opposed to the US ones, which have a more coarser feel overall. And then by 1959, when we get to the Butterick patterns, they're still unprinted, which is perfectly fine. I'm not exactly 100% sure of the reason. If there's any printer pressers out there, those are not words, but you know who you are, in case there's any printing folk out there that have a little bit more of an insight as to why exactly they opted to remain unprinted. I would love to hear from you. Overall, I would say the differences are pretty negligible. They all still seem to be pretty much within the same realm of patterns that are from their counterparts across the pond, but not necessarily so badly that you wouldn't be able to deal with one or the other. It just might be a little bit of a shock when you go to buy that British pattern with the pence on it, and you come to find out that it's actually unprinted. So just be prepared, or when in doubt, ask the seller. And again, folks, if you would like to buy one of our vintage sewist pens between Quirky Turkey and myself, please make sure that you head to my website, backroomfinds.com, to make sure that you snag one before we stop the pre-sale. And it's contest time! That's right, friends. If you have made it to this far in the video, first up, you should probably like the video so that the algorithm picks it up and sends it elsewhere so that others may find us. And you can also comment down below, why not metric? And you'll be entered in to win one of these brooches. That's right, the very one that you see on me, I am going to be raffling off. How you enter is making sure that you comment down below, why not metric, make sure that you like and are subscribed to my channel, and be sure to leave me your Instagram handle in that comment so that way I can actually find you and get you your prize. You don't have to be subscribed to me on Instagram. You can if you want, but you don't have to be. It's just a lot easier for me to contact you on Instagram than it is through YouTube. Anyways, friends, if you enjoyed this video, please do make sure you leave it a like. Give me a subscribe if you want to continue to see my face and see other vintage pattern shenanigans / showing shenanigans that I have coming up. And turn on the bell notification so that maybe YouTube will tell you the next time that I launch a new video. Stay beautiful, friends. We'll see y'all next time. Because why actually prepare a script when you can just wing it off some notes? Welcome to my channel. What was that noise? That was not good. But I do think this was a pretty Well, color me surprised. Let's start with the envelope. You have to leave a breath. Well, color me surprised. Not there. Such a mess of an intro. Good luck editing, Stephanie. Is that it? It is it. Why that took me so long to find is ridiculous. Okay. Oh, well, that's not new. That's not what we do at all. And I do feel like the best way to do this is going to do like my. In my head, I deliver this so much better.